Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Ryan and I'm a former Royal Marines commando from the UK, and today we're going to be reacting to this is how the Russian war in Ukraine ends. It's a while since we've done a bit of a reaction video like this from this channel, but the link will be in the description. Make sure to go show them some support. The infographic show, although it doesn't get all of the information and sometimes we disagree with it, it certainly does a good job of the video, I personally believe anyway. So looking forward to this one, guys, if you are too. Thanks for stopping by. Let's just get straight into it.
On February 24th, 2022, Russia brought war back to Europe after almost 8 decades of peace. Its invasion of Ukraine has shattered all expectations of modern European powers resolving their problems peacefully, and brought NATO itself to the brink of full-blown war against Russia. But this is only one of 4 possible ways this war ends, and the other 3 may surprise you.
Right, so this is a video from about a month ago, so bear in mind some of the information probably will have changed since then, especially the outcomes of how this war is going to play out. 4 weeks ago, is that kind of around the time when Finland and Sweden agreed to join NATO? I think it is about that time.
To date, Russia has lost an estimated 30,000 men, either killed, captured, or wounded in action. That amounts to roughly 25% of the initial invasion force's ground combat troops in just over 2 months of fighting. By comparison, the United States lost 58,222 killed in action over the course of the entire Vietnam War. To put it simply, such incredible casualty rates are not only unprecedented, but completely unsustainable.
Yeah, unsustainable, and it just shows the sheer lack of care via Russia. You know, Russian men are getting slaughtered on an unbelievable scale. Now, we need to look at this from 2 sides of the argument. Yes, they're the aggressors in the war. And even if you say anything remotely positive about them, i.e. in support of the not wanting death to happen on either side, people might call you a sympathizer for saying that. It's not. You just respect life in general. Now, I don't think any death in war is worth it. Doesn't matter what side it's on, whether it's from the Russian or the Ukraine side. I know a lot of people would disagree with me on that, but yeah, that many deaths is wiping out some good men in the gene pool, that's for sure. And it's a shame because that's what war seems to do.
Already, Russian losses are severe enough that it's estimated it'll take roughly 2 years to replace its tank losses alone. And that's only if international sanctions are lifted from the nation, so it once again has access to the high-tech electronic components it doesn't produce at home. If not, Russia will be back to building Cold War-era tanks, which, as we've already seen, can't even stand up to man-portable NATO firepower, let alone a fully equipped NATO armored brigade. While there's currently a lot of talk about mobilization, Russian military leaders admit that mobilization will do little to help Russia win this war. It would take 90 days to fully mobilize a replacement tank regiment, and even then, they would only be equipped with Cold War leftover tanks from Russia's vast reserves of very obsolete equipment.
See, this is the thing that even in the comments of my other videos gets brought up an awful lot about why you're not, shown the true information, what's going on over there. You know, Russia aren't doing half as bad as what people say they're doing, X, Y, and Z. Yeah, well, let's just take that standpoint. But they're taking it from a standpoint where the kit and equipment that they're using in replacement of the kit that's getting smashed is, it really is old and obsolete stuff, okay? In comparison to Ukraine, you know, they're getting supplied with state-of-the-art weaponry and kit from around the world, which is more sustainable in the long run. So let's just take the narrative that Russia are doing all right. They're doing good in terms of the artillery bombardment. That's only going to work out for as long as they've got munitions for that. The stockpiles and stuff, we can already see that Ukraine are taking out some of the stockpiles orientated and located in and around Ukraine. So yeah, that'll only last as long as it lasts, as simple as that. And you better believe that the likes of Ukraine will have a countermeasure in place to be able to, you know, stop them from having as much of a stockpile in the first place, i.e. taking out these bomb factories and stuff. But a lot of the kit in Russia is old, obsolete. Its sell-by date is already passed, so, you know, there's no longevity in it. I think the scales will literally all of a sudden just completely flip the other way with Russia, and it'll be a monumental disaster in the end. I don't care how good they're doing right now. I do believe there'll be a tipping point, and that tipping point's not going to be a gradual thing. It's going to be an instant one, pretty much. We've seen that happen in Afghanistan. All right, they were smashing the Mujahideen and using all the weaponry, state of the art. You know, there were heavy bombardments. The military was allegedly, you know, doing the job and doing the business. But then all of a sudden they got the tables turned, and when they did, the tables turned drastically against Russia. Yes, they had ground-to-air missiles that were being provided from the United States to the Mujahideen at the time, which definitely helped them out. But yeah, the scales with Russia, once they tip, they'll tip very quick.
These tanks and their completely green conscript crews would perform even worse in Ukraine than Russia's current tank forces. Replenishing Russia's dwindling air power assets is simply untenable until sanctions are lifted, or Russia takes the years necessary to retool its economy to provide high-tech electronics at home and build new aircraft. That's why the first possible way that the war in Ukraine ends is with a whimper rather than a bang. At some point, the flow of equipment reaching Ukraine from the West will simply outweigh the flow of obsolete equipment flowing into the nation from Russia. NATO military tech overpowers Russia's obsolete Cold War-era equipment, and Russian losses continue to mount, trying to break stiff Ukrainian defenses. To offset combat losses in personnel, Russia enacts mobilization and floods the conflict with additional conscripts. These conscripts are undertrained and poorly equipped, as well as suffering from extremely poor morale. They've been thrown into a war against a brother nation that none of them wanted to fight, while the professional volunteer soldiers, whose morale is also starting to slip, force them into combat under threats of punishment.
Right, so that's a bit where I'm not too sure about how they're getting that information about the morale on the ground, information regarding whether they want to be part of that war in the first place. I don't know how he's got that information. I'm just trying to speak from my own experience in the military about how that information would get out there. I think that's an assumption, personally. I think we can only assume that they don't want this war. You never know. A lot of the people fighting on the Russian side might be all for it. They might be all for this war. They might be wanting to do what they're doing over there. I don't think we can easily gauge that. I don't think we can easily gauge it from the media outlets as well, because there's so many different sources of information that would contradict each other. It's just not easy to say that. But I'd like to hear your opinion on that. Do you think the morale within the Russian rank system and the troops there on the ground in Ukraine is low? I don't know, personally, so I'm not going to say what I think it will be. I would like to hear from you guys.
In some cases, under threat of death, as it's been reported that Chechen Kadyrovites have shot Russian soldiers who refused to fight. The influx of manpower has the reverse effect in the fighting that Russia's hoping for. The tens of thousands of conscripts set loose across the front requires intense resupply at a time when Russia is already struggling to resupply the forces it already had in country. The weak morale and poor training work against Russia by leading to massive casualties and surrenders and engagements across Ukraine. Eventually, the bad morale becomes extremely infectious, leading to very serious breakdowns in discipline. We've already seen how.
Right, yeah. I have seen this on a much smaller scale about how low morale can affect individuals within the rank structures. If that becomes toxic, it spreads like wildfire, and before you know it, you're feeling the same way. So it's important for leaders to step in at this point, well before it gets to any kind of disruption within the how you're being affected as a soldier within a fighting team, within a troop, within a company. So yeah, I think that's all about leadership, being able to gauge the men appropriately. But, in the Royal Marines, and I can only speak for the Royal Marines, that's why our selection process was as hard as it was. That's why we went through one of the hardest, most rigorous amphibious infantry training courses on the planet. It's to make sure that you're the right type of individual who won't get to that point. You'll have the self-discipline to be able to understand when you're becoming a little bit intolerable, a little bit toxic, a little bit negative with your persona and your approach to things. You've got to be cheerful in the face of adversity, as we would say in the Marines, and that positivity, it shows, and it's very easy to lose sight of that at some point, and it does spread. So if you know you're doing that, you're being a bit of a bad egg, you've got to stop it. But you need self-discipline to do that. And you need to be a tough individual. That's why our training was so hard, to weed out those individuals who may cause a little bit disruption. Doesn't say it doesn't happen. It does happen, all right? I've seen it. I've been part of it. I've been sometimes the perpetrator of negativity. But we always seem to why now next back in? But this is where leadership comes in. Leadership is the true sealer of the fate of low morale within an organization like this, and they're the ones who can rein it back in, that's for sure.
One Russian tank commander had his legs crushed by a subordinate in anger at the extreme losses the unit took. Inevitably, a further Russian advance into Ukraine simply becomes impossible, and the offensive stops. Putin declares victory by saying that he has taken the Donbas region and secured the vital seaport of Mariupol and the all-important waterways leading to Crimea that Ukraine had previously dammed off after Russia seized the peninsula illegally in 2014. This falls way short of Putin's original goals of toppling the Ukrainian government and installing a puppet government, but it still leaves Russia in control of very strategically and economically important areas of Ukraine, while choking off about half of Ukraine's ability to export goods. The situation is not great for Russia, but it's not awful either, and if one overlooks the staggering casualties it took to get there, one might even consider it a win. However, the Ukrainians would have to accept this situation, and it's unlikely they're willing to simply give a quarter of their country over to Russians, especially if they're winning, and while certainly Ukraine isn't winning, it's definitely not losing either. There's every sign that
that's probably the best way I've heard it yet. There's a lot of comments on my channel saying, you don't know what's going on over there. How can you be so pro-Ukraine? Blah blah blah. I just support I'm supporting the side that I want to win. I want Ukraine to defeat the Russians in this whole thing. That's just my personal opinion and belief. But I couldn't have put it better myself, the way he said it there.
Despite Putin's earlier assurances that he wasn't interested in physically occupying Ukraine, that this is no longer the case. Though given Putin's laundry list of lies to date, it's likely this too was a pre-planned act of deception. In Russian-occupied areas, the Russian government is now guaranteeing pensions for Ukrainian citizens living there, as well as introducing the ruble as an official currency and even replacing street signs with those written in the Russian language.
Yeah, right. As if that's going to happen. That's something that, with the lies that he's spread so far, I don't think he's going to be giving these poor individuals pensions. He's basically invading the country, killing the people who's living and occupied there, and then having the audacity to say, well, if we're successful with our efforts, we'll give you a pension. Is this guy delusional? He's one of the, if not the richest person unofficially on the planet, and he's offering people a shitty pension. You can't write this stuff, guys.
A massive effort to Russify the occupied territories is underway, with frightening speed, and perhaps most worryingly of all is the fact that one of the first things being brought into occupied territories is Russian television. This means that for citizens in occupied Ukraine, their only news source is now Russian state-run news, and its non-stop blitzkrieg of propaganda. Putin is clearly not planning on ceding occupied territories back to Ukraine, but what if Ukraine fights back? Across the modern Eastern Front in Ukraine, Ukrainian forces are pushing back against Russian positions and liberating villages. However, they're also losing ground in the south. The entire front has become a back and forth reminiscent of 20th century wars. But the all-important here is that Ukraine was not supposed to be able to push back against Russian forces at all. Ukrainian forces were supposed to be completely overwhelmed by superior Russian firepower.
Yeah, they were. But we can't treat Ukraine in the same light as we did before the special operation, should we say? Even though it's war, we can't treat them in the same within the same light anymore, because NATO, yes, probably would have been. Ukraine probably would have been a little bit incompetent. They probably would have had bad morale. Probably would have had bad equipment and not as good training had friendly countries not intervened. They've had billions and billions of pounds worth of kit and equipment and training from the likes of the UK, the USA, Germany, France, Norway. The list goes on with the support that they've had. So, yeah, it would be safe to say that those things would have been the case had intervention not take place. Thank goodness the intervention took place.
And yet, we've discovered that Russia is almost as big a threat to itself due to incompetence, bad morale, bad equipment, and worse training.
I think they're out their wits' end, not because of those reasons, actually, but because of the lack of support they've got from other countries. No one supports them in this decision. Yes, I hear that, India might support various parts of the decision-making process, but that's literally, in my personal opinion, because of the oil, all right, fuel. It's one of the few countries that's still buying fuel, I believe, off them. So There's reasons why, okay? But Russia just hasn't got the support from the rest of the world. Otherwise, they'd have been in a pretty strong position had they had support from people.
As it is to Ukraine. Ukraine could simply refuse to accept Russian occupation and continue fighting. The United States of America has already pledged to continue supporting Ukraine militarily until, as House Speaker Nancy Pelosi put it, the fighting is done. Europe may not be.
And this is where I might upset a few people again, but I've just got to be honest. I'm not really a fan of Nancy Pelosi. I don't know too much on American politics. I don't want to even pretend to, but there's something about that woman that I just dislike a lot. I don't know what it is. What do you guys think? Let me know if my American fans and friends are in the chat.
So eager to support an ongoing war in Ukraine, but they don't have to be. In terms of overall contributions to Ukraine, Europe's contributions are a little above symbolic, with the lion's share of support coming from the United States. In recent meetings with America's defense industry leaders, President Joe Biden worked to create a strategy for the ongoing resupply of Ukraine, even if the war lasts for years. As long as Ukraine is willing to fight, the U.S. looks willing to continue supporting it, and the longer Ukraine wants to fight, the worse it might get for the Russians. Already, the initial stance on not supporting Ukraine with heavy equipment has shifted. This was due to the stunning performance of Ukrainian troops and the equally stunning incompetence of Russian troops. Western analysts predicted Ukraine would fall within 3 days, and nobody believed that Ukraine's military could survive, let alone beat back the Russian assault at Kyiv and beyond. Now that the U.S. believes Ukraine can fight for months, even years, it opens up the door for providing Ukraine with heavier equipment.
And a lot of money being brought into the country as well. This is where war gets a little bit shady once you start delving deeper into it. This is where the whole thing does become a little bit shady, in my opinion. Whether I'm right or wrong, there's a lot of money going to be getting sent there, and the longer this war turns out to go, it does leave a lot of people's pockets full of money, in my opinion. Maybe it's not to start with, but long term, people are going to be profiting. The private security industry have got a whole new place to go and a whole new place to extort money from. Well, I'm not going to get too deep into that. I'll let you guys, come up with your own assumptions of what I'm trying to say.
Already, the U.S. has provided Soviet-built helicopters it sourced from other nations, as well as other equipment that Ukrainians are already familiar with. However, if Ukraine is committed to fighting for years and the stalemate in the East holds, there's reason to believe the United States would begin arming Ukraine with modern American equipment. This would require months of training for its crews, but after which Ukraine would be fielding capabilities far superior to Russia's own. This is only possible if Ukraine continues this fight for years, as it would take that long to train Ukrainian troops and create the logistical networks required for repairing and replenishing sophisticated equipment, such as the M1 Abrams. Yet, if Ukraine has to date held against the Russian onslaught, there's little reason to believe the nation couldn't hold a status quo for the necessary time to rearm itself with Western equipment. Under assault from a Western-armed Ukraine, Russia would lose badly in the East and be forced to retreat. At this point, there's only two ways this war ends. The first is with a humiliating admission of defeat by Russia and a general withdrawal. This is extremely unlikely, but as the war costs continue to add up for Russia, Ukraine may be able to force this defeat condition even with current equipment. However, this would be an admission of catastrophic failure to be remembered for all of Russian history and is an unlikely move to be made by any Russian public official.
Yeah, but saying that, it's not as if it's the first time they've had like a monumental failing within the military and war kind of arena. It's happened a number of times with Russia, and it's almost like the political leaders don't really care. I'm surprised. This is the biggest thing that surprised me. This is the thing that I grew up with as well, okay? The whole Cold War era. My dad was in the military at the time. I've got friends who served in Germany when Russia was, 2 minutes you got within the strike distance of how long it would take to get for you to be wiped out, essentially. So I do understand the fear that's been generated for 10, 20, 30 years with Russia. This superpower characterisms that they've been given. I don't know where that's come from. I would love to know where it's come from, because essentially they've just bullied their way to that position without any real without any real kind of success. And I'm not a historian on war or anything, but if any of you guys have got anything that you could add to show, look, no, this is where Russia has been really successful in the past in terms of the military and war, I would like to know. Let me know in the chat, because it's almost like they've got this reputation of being as fierce as something like America, but you know, America is fierce because of all of the right reasons. Look at their history, look at their war accolades, look at where they've been and done. They're a literal super powerhouse, okay, because of their history. Russia, I'm not so convinced. It seems to me like they've just had many failings time and time again, and they treat their people shit. You know, the public are not really well looked after. I served in the British military with, I'm not going to mention this person's name. I was on a course with her, and she was of Russian heritage, and you know, she came out publicly and said how terrible this is, and how the Russian people have suffered for years and years, you know, at the hands of terrible leadership. So it's like, yeah, I don't know where this notoriety came from. It's, yeah, it baffles me.
The second way this could end is with the use of weapons of mass destruction against Ukrainian forces.
They're not going to use weapons of mass destruction. I'm sick of people shitting themselves about this. I've said it time and time again. It's not happening. That's the end of everything as we know it, and it isn't going to end that way. It's just not. Like, let's get over that.
This includes nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. Currently, Russia has nothing to fear from Ukrainian retaliation over the use of WMDs, as the nation has none in its arsenal. Most worryingly, Russia has already planted the seeds for the justification of WMD use by creating propaganda that claims Ukraine itself has been working on chemical and biological weapons under the supervision of Russia's favorite boogeyman, the US. This is, of course, a blatant lie, as Ukraine has no WMDs, and if it did, surely it would have used them in the initial desperate
we've heard that before with countries that haven't had WMDs.
Hours of the war, when it seemed as if Russian troops would take Kyiv. Even without Ukraine overpowering Russian troops after years of armament by the West, Putin might still turn to the use of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. President Joe Biden has declared this a line in the sand that would be met with an appropriate response. What this means is anyone's guess, but it's feared this would mean retaliation by the United States itself, proportional to the attack carried out by Russia. If Russia uses chemical weapons, the U.S. might launch a chemical attack against Russian troops inside Ukraine. The U.S. would be unlikely to use such weapons inside Russia itself, for fear of escalating the situation, and the only type of attack it might respond tit for tat for might be a nuclear one. The only thing Ukraine needs less than one nuclear attack on its own soil is 2 nuclear attacks on its territory. This brings us to yet another way that war in Ukraine could end. If Russia were to turn to the use of WMDs and the United States responded in kind, it could lead to that of which the world has been most fearing.
Most fearing and most controlled because of that fear. So I've just went with the narrative of, yeah, it's not happening, and I don't believe it. And I think it's easier to be that way. We've been scared for this for too long and not really seen any kind of real evidence that anyone's going to ever use these things. You know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's gone. That's been and gone. We need to move on from this scaremongering tactic of, they're going to be using nuclear warheads. Anyone who does that knows that it's game over. It really grips me, actually, when we start talking about weapons of mass destruction. It's just not a feasible. It doesn't work for anyone. It doesn't work for anyone.
A full-blown confrontation between NATO and Russia. And yet this is a nightmare scenario for Russia, given how extremely poor its troops have performed against Ukraine's military, which is largely armed with Cold War weapons. Taking on NATO's professionally trained and well-equipped militaries would be a catastrophe of the highest order for Russian forces. And while before the West feared Russia's growing military might, the war in Ukraine has proven that Russia was a paper tiger all along.
Russia has always been a paper tiger in that respect.
This is why, despite Putin's tough rhetoric against the West, the very last thing he wants to see is NATO tanks gathering outside Kaliningrad. Putin might speak tough, but he really has to ask himself just how many wars he wants to be losing at once. Our final way that the war in Ukraine might end is one that seems unlikely at first glance, but is frighteningly possible if several key facts about the conflict change. Currently, Russia is bombing civilians in their homes, and even going to great lengths to specifically target civilian shelters. Russia is also destroying civilian infrastructure not just in the east where the heaviest fighting is taking place, but all the way as far west as Lviv, which had its power plant bombed by Russia. Despite having no military value, these random civilian targets are in fact far from random because they have great terror value. Putin's strategy is simple. It follows the same strategy that Russia used in Syria. By targeting civilians, he hopes to create mass panic and fear across the country.
Yeah, and mass panic and fear does work. Once you get the public scared, they will pretty much do what you want them to do. We've seen that time and time again in many, many wars. So I'm not surprised that he's using that tactic in the slightest. It just shows what kind of a coward this man is.
Eventually prodding the people to sue for peace. In Syria, terrorized civilians refused to support rebel forces. In Ukraine, a terrorized population could demand that its military stop fighting. With no political will to fight, Ukraine could surrender to Russia without Russia ever needing to completely dominate it. It's likely this campaign of terror would backfire against Russia, seeing as how the nation doesn't enjoy the military superiority it enjoyed in Syria. However, should it work, Russia would end up installing a pro-Kremlin leader into power in Ukraine. Given the fact that today Russia seems to have no intention on returning occupied territories and is even going so far as to Russify them, a puppet leader could call for a referendum on Ukraine, rejoining Russia in the style of a former Soviet republic. It's even possible that Russia would actually rebrand itself as the Soviet Union again, something that is likely extremely appealing to a Cold War diehard like Vladimir Putin. A new Iron Curtain could fall across Europe, and the Cold War 2.0 would begin anew. With Ukraine pacified, Putin would inevitably invade Moldova. Recently, a Russian general
been speaking about this, Moldova. My wife used to work for a company who had an office out in Moldova. And as this whole thing was escalating, they were due to go out there to do some work. And I was saying, with the tensions in Russia, because I was following the news closely at the time, you don't want to go over there. And everyone in Moldova was saying, no, it's going to be fine. It's never going to happen. They're not going to steamroll into Ukraine. Literally a month later, it happened, and they changed their tune and the trip was cancelled. So it's, Moldova's a strange one because, they haven't really got the means to protect themselves, quite literally. Very small individual place, very, very isolated when you think about it. If Ukraine is literally on the border, Moldova is an easy target. And if Ukraine were to fall to Russia, I definitely believe Moldova would just be, I think Moldova would just go, just do what you need to do, because there's no fight in Moldova, to put it that way. It's just, it would be a steamroll.
Will accidentally let slip what seemed to be Putin's real goals in Ukraine. His efforts focused on creating a land corridor across southern Ukraine that would not only cut off Ukraine from the sea and choke its economy, but also allow access to the Moldovan breakaway region of Transnistria. From there, Russian forces could pour into Moldova as well, all under the guise of protecting Russian native speakers. Putin would be 2 steps closer to restoring the former Soviet Union in its full glory, with eyes indubitably turning west toward Latvia, Lithuania, and Slovakia. These 3 nations are currently NATO members, which makes it doubtful Putin would seriously try to invade them, especially after President Biden's declaration that the United States would fight for every inch of NATO territory. The wording of this proclamation wasn't an accident either, as the United States has been aware of internal Russian brainstorming that involved launching a tiny incursion into a Baltic state, just enough to take a single village or a few miles of border territory, and then digging in defensively. This would force NATO to go to war against the entrenched Russian defense force over an insignificant border incursion. Seeing as some current NATO members didn't even want the Baltic states to join the alliance in the first place due to their vulnerability to Russia, it's possible NATO would splinter internally over the invocation of Article 5. This would destroy confidence in the alliance, especially from its most vulnerable members in the East, and could lead to a collapse of NATO on the whole. This would leave the United States and perhaps a few other European countries fighting an extremely unpopular war that a significant portion of Europe doesn't even want. In such a scenario, it's
I don't think, in short, that scenario would happen at all.
Possible Russia wins this confrontation with the West and is allowed to take as much of the Baltics as it really wants. Vladimir Putin would have finally succeeded in restoring the Soviet Union in whole and greatly escalating the potential for a devastating nuclear conflict. Now go on.
Right then, so this is how the Russian war ends in Ukraine. Not really conclusive, to be honest with you, in that. Good video by the infographics nonetheless. The thing I like about infographics is it kind of opens the door for more questions. So, I look forward to seeing in the comments below what your thoughts are on that. But for me, how Russian war ends is personally, I think it's going to be a long drawn out war. Why? Because there's a lot of money to be made in Ukraine by that happening anywhere. you know, they have the means, if they have the support, to be able to fight a long drawn out war for years and years, especially if America is on board. So that's what I think happens. It's long, it's drawn out. Russia ends up, you know, there's a tipping point, and I think the scales will tip immediately. I don't think we're going to see that happen, you know, gradually with Russia. We've seen again in Afghanistan. I think it'll be a similar thing. There'll be a game-changing event in Russia. There'll be a game-changing bit of kit or equipment or a tactic or something that just completely takes Russia to its weakness, and literally the scales will tip, as we've seen with the ground-to-air missiles that took out pretty much a lot of most of the air capabilities in Afghanistan. There'll be something that happens in Russia that takes out a very specific capability indeed, and I think it might actually, at this rate, be the HIMARS. I think the HIMARS has the ability to change this whole war, personally. But what do you guys think? If you like this video, smash the like button. Thanks for supporting the channel. As always, if you want to be a member, press that join button. If you're already a member, you know, you guys are the unsung heroes, really. You keep me having the ability to do these videos every single day by showing your support effectively, and I'm forever grateful of that, you know. And yeah, I can't thank you guys enough. So until next time, peace.